The last day of death row. Inmate Blaine Milam, the baby exorcism case, ends in execution. It is the case of Blaine Keith Milam, a young man whose name became synonymous with terror after the shocking death of a 13-month-old child. What makes this case so disturbing is not only the brutality of the crime, but also the twisted justification behind it, a so-called exorcism that turned into hours of unthinkable suffering. For years, Milam's execution has been delayed, challenged, and paused. But now Texas has marked September 25, 2025 as the date when his sentence will finally be carried out. Tonight, we will retrace the events that led to this tragic day, uncover the courtroom battles that kept him alive for nearly 2 decades, and look closely at what his final hours may hold. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to Deathwatch Diaries for more prison documentary stories. In December of 2008, Blaine Milam was only 18 years old. He lived with his girlfriend, Jessica Carson, who was also just a teenager at the time, and her daughter Amora. The couple lived in a mobile home, barely making ends meet. On the surface, they looked like any other struggling young family. But beneath that fragile picture was a storm of dysfunction, violence, and delusion. Milam was already on the sex offender registry, and he had shown troubling behaviors long before the night that made his name infamous. On December 2nd, a 911 call came from that small home. Jessica Carson told emergency services that she and Milam had gone to a pawn shop, leaving baby Amora alone. And when they returned, they found her lifeless. When police arrived, however, it was clear that the story didn't add up. Amora wasn't just unresponsive. She was covered in injuries, her body already stiff from rigor mortis. It was evident she had been gone for some time, and the horrific truth would soon emerge. The autopsy on little Amora revealed injuries so severe that even seasoned investigators struggled to process them. She had been beaten across her body, sustaining fractures in her arms and legs. Her tiny ribs were broken 18 in total, and there were deep bruises under her scalp, signaling blunt force trauma. Her liver was lacerated, and there was evidence of strangulation. Bite marks were found from head to toe, and medical examiners testified that she had endured hours of suffering before her death. What made this case even more disturbing was the explanation given by Blaine Milam. In his confession, he admitted that he believed Amora was possessed by demons. He claimed he was performing an exorcism, trying to drive the evil out of her by beating her. Jessica Carson, the baby's mother, did not intervene. Instead, she admitted to being present and watching the ordeal unfold. In the eyes of the law, that made her complicit. At trial, Milam's defense tried to frame his actions as the result of delusion, fueled by superstition and poor judgment. But the jury could not ignore the evidence. Amora had suffered for nearly 30 hours, a span of time in which her cries could have been heard and her life saved. The jury was unanimous. In May of 2010, Milam was sentenced to death. A year later, Jessica Carson faced her own trial. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for her role in allowing her daughter to suffer at the hands of Milam. She now serves that sentence at the Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas. But the legal battles did not end there. Milam's case would go on to become one of the most drawn-out in Texas death row history. His first execution date was scheduled in 2019, but it was stayed after his lawyers challenged the forensic evidence about the bite marks on Amora's body. The defense argued that the science used to tie him to those marks was unreliable. Though the appeal did not overturn his conviction, it was enough to halt the execution. In 2021, another date was set. But once again, the execution was stopped. This time, the issue centered on the drugs Texas planned to use for lethal injection. Courts ruled that the state must disclose the exact substances, their sources, and how they were made. Texas had withheld that information, and so the execution was paused. Over the years, Milam's lawyers also tried to introduce evidence about his mental health. They claimed that he suffered from severe psychological disorders that were never properly considered at trial. But appeal after appeal was denied. And as the years passed, the family of little Amora continued to wait for justice. Life on death row for Blaine Milam was a strange existence. Unlike many other inmates whose cases fade from public memory, his remained a point of controversy because of the horrifying details of the crime. For nearly 15 years, he lived inside a small cell at the Polunsky Unit, Where Texas houses its condemned men, inmates there are kept in solitary confinement, spending 23 hours a day in their cells, with 1 hour allowed for recreation in a caged yard. During those years, Milam reportedly became quieter, no longer speaking much about his case, but the appeals continued, often raising procedural issues rather than new evidence. Still, each stay of execution meant another year of waiting for Amora's family. Now, in 2025, all those appeals have run their course. The state of Texas has set September 25th as the date when Milam will be executed. As that date approaches, attention has turned once again to what Milam's final hours will look like. In Texas, the condemned are offered the standard meal served to other inmates, not a special request. This is because in 2015, the state abolished last meal requests after an infamous case in which an inmate ordered an elaborate meal and refused to eat it. Reports suggest that Milam has expressed little interest in food during his time on death row, focusing instead on his appeals. Whether he will speak final words remains uncertain. Witnesses at executions are usually divided between the inmate's family, the victim's relatives, and members of the press. In this case, it is expected that members of Amora's family will be present, though after so many years, the pain has not faded. For them, the execution is not about closure, but about remembering the child they lost and the suffering she endured. The case of Blaine Milam forces us to confront some of the darkest questions about crime, punishment, and belief. How could two young adults convince themselves that a child was possessed by demons? How could they watch her suffer without stepping in to protect her? And after nearly 17 years of appeals and delays, does the execution of Blaine Milam bring any sense of justice for the state of Texas? The answer lies in the law. Milam was tried, convicted, and sentenced by a jury of his peers. His appeals were heard and denied. Now, the state will carry out the sentence. For Amora's family, the scars of that December day in 2008 will never fully heal, but they will at least know that the man who ended her life will no longer draw breath. As the story of Blaine Milam reaches its grim ending, we are left with the haunting memory of a little girl who never had a chance to grow. Dear friends, Amora Carson's name must never be lost in the darkness of this case. While legal arguments and years of appeals focused on Blaine Milam, the true tragedy is that of a 13-month-old child whose life was stolen under the most unimaginable circumstances. After nearly 2 decades of delays, the state of Texas has set September 25, 2020 as the date to carry out justice. For Amora's family, the pain will never truly fade, but perhaps the long wait for accountability will finally come to an end. This case stands as a chilling reminder of how superstition and cruelty can destroy innocence in an instant. Stay with us on Deathwatch Diaries as we continue to bring you prison documentary stories that reveal the truth behind death row.